Hello and welcome. Today we are tackling one of the biggest, most profound questions in all of history, and we're going to do it by looking at the work of historian Richard Carrier. The question, was Jesus of Nazareth an actual historical person? We're going to investigate the case for what's known as mythicism. So, let's just put it right out there. This is the question at the very heart of it all. Did a man named Jesus of Nazareth really walk the earth? Now, for most of history, the answer has just been an assumed yes, of course. But what happens when we stop assuming? What if we treat it like a genuine historical mystery that needs to be solved? You know, this whole debate has usually been seen as a simple conflict, belief on one side and history on the other. But what if that whole framework is the problem? What if, to get to the bottom of it, we need a totally different set of tools? And this is exactly where Richard Carrier's work comes into play. He argues that we should approach this whole thing like a detective trying to solve a cold case. The tools aren't faith or just sticking to tradition. The main tool is a really rigorous use of logic and, as we're about to see, probability. Okay, so let's start by laying out the puzzle itself. To get anywhere, you first have to understand the two competing theories that are at the absolute core of this investigation. So on one side, you have historicity. This is the view most people are familiar with. A real, flesh-and-blood man named Jesus lived, he preached, he was executed, and only later did his followers start believing he was a god. But on the other side, you have mythicism. This theory flips that completely on its head. It suggests Jesus started as a purely celestial, heavenly being that people believed in, and that it was only later that authors wrote him into a human story set on Earth. Now, what's really interesting is how Carrier kicks things off. He's actually pretty critical of a lot of past arguments for mythicism. He basically says they've often been based on some pretty shaky scholarship. So his goal isn't just to rehash old ideas, but to build a brand new case from scratch using a clear, consistent method that anyone can check. All right, next step. To evaluate the evidence, Carrier says we first have to understand the crime scene, and that's the mindset of the ancient world. The early Roman Empire was a very, very different place, and if we don't get our heads around that, we're going to misread all the clues. So what did this world look like? Well, it was filled with what we call mystery cults. These were religions all about personal salvation. Blending gods and myths from different cultures, or syncretism, was totally normal. There was also this growing trend towards believing in one supreme God who ruled over all the lesser ones. And the whole point of religion was shifting from the well-being of the city or tribe to saving your own individual eternal soul. And you know what? Early Christianity had all of these features. And this right here, this is a huge one. Back then, having visions or divine revelations wasn't seen as a sign of mental illness. Actually, it was the opposite. Claiming that you got your information directly from a god was a totally legitimate way to get people to take you seriously. This is so important for understanding the evidence we're about to look at. Okay, so with that ancient mindset as our backdrop, let's dive into Section 3, Rereading the Gospels. Carrier argues we need to look at this key evidence with fresh eyes. So the big argument here is that we've been reading the Gospels all wrong. Carrier says they aren't meant to be read like modern biographies or simple history books. Instead, they're incredibly complex works of literature, just packed with symbolism and allegory, and built on top of older Jewish scriptures.
Here is a perfect example of what he means. On the left, you've got the Gospel of Mark describing the crucifixion. On the right, a line from Psalm 22 written hundreds of years earlier. Look at that. The phrasing is almost identical. Now, Carrier argues this isn't a fulfilled prophecy. He says it's literary invention. The author of Mark was basically using the Psalms as a script to build his story.
He uses this great modern analogy to explain it. Think about it. West Side Story is set in New York City, not Verona, Italy. The details are completely different. But would anyone seriously argue that it's not a retelling of Romeo and Juliet? Of course not. He suggests the gospel writers were doing the exact same thing, creating a new story that was deliberately designed to echo older sacred ones. Okay, this brings us to a really crucial part of the argument, the silence of Paul. So if the Gospels are literary works written later, what about our absolute earliest Christian writer? The Apostle Paul was writing decades before the Gospels. So what does he have to say? First, let's get some scale here. In just the letters that virtually all scholars agree Paul actually wrote, we have over 20,000 words of his. That is a lot of text, a substantial record of his beliefs. So here's the big question. In all of those thousands of words, how many times does Paul ever mention a single biographical detail about a Jesus who had just been alive on Earth? You know, things like his parents, his ministry, his trial, a parable, a miracle, any of those details that are all over the Gospels? The answer, according to Carrier's analysis, is pretty shocking. Zero. Not once. Paul never quotes a teaching from an earthly Jesus, never talks about his ministry, never mentions a single miracle or his trial. Instead, Paul says over and over that his knowledge of Christ comes from two places, Scripture and his own private revelations. So, what kind of Jesus does Paul talk about? Well, Carrier argues Paul is describing a cosmic being, a Christ figure who lived, died, and was resurrected entirely in a heavenly realm. And he wasn't crucified by the Romans on earth, but by what Paul calls the demonic rulers of this age up in the sky. For Paul, the whole drama was a celestial event. So, how do you weigh all of this evidence? The literary gospels, Paul's strange silence. How do you put it all together to reach a conclusion? Well, this is where Carrier turns to a formal reasoning tool from the world of math. He uses the logic of something called Bayes' theorem. Now, don't worry about the complex math here. The core idea is actually pretty simple. First, you start with an initial estimate. Based on what we know about that time period, how likely was it for a figure like Jesus to have existed in the first place? Then you go through all the evidence, piece by piece, and for each piece you ask, does this evidence make more sense if Jesus was historical, or does it make more sense if he was a myth? Every piece of evidence then pushes the final probability one way or the other. So after he runs all the data, the Gospels, Paul's letters, the cultural context, everything, through this logical system, Carrier arrives at his conclusion. His analysis finds that, based on the evidence we have, the mythicist theory is actually more probable than the historicist theory. And this is a really, really key point to get right. Carrier is not saying a historical Jesus is impossible. That's not the claim. His conclusion is more precise. He's arguing that, given the specific evidence we currently have, the idea of a historical man being the origin of Christianity is, from a probabilistic view, improbable. In the end, wrestling with a question like this, no matter where you land, forces us to think about something even bigger. It really makes you step back and ask a fundamental question about how we know anything about the past. How much of what we call history is a record of what really happened, and how much of it is just a powerful story that we've all agreed to tell?